Good afternoon to all of you, and I think it's a real privilege to be speaking to such a distinguished audience this afternoon on what my ministry here in the Government of India does in the technology space and what are the newer things that we are really attempting to do. There's one bit which is very clear and one bit which I think many sessions which you've had and which you'll be having will address, which relates to the digital public infrastructure space and where Government of India plans to go with it. It was a centerpiece of what was stated in the G20 summit declaration earlier this year, and an important piece of what we want to do as part of India's own responsibility to the global south. Having said that, I think there are many other elements of the way that the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology is approaching this whole question of where the digital opportunity really lies for India. In some ways, and I was at a similar event joining virtually, where the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, Geeta Gopinath, made this point that today, with the technology revolution, including artificial intelligence, we are perhaps at the cusp of a time very similar to where we were with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, and the opportunities are almost similar. Where that leaves a country like India with is a historic opportunity possibly to leapfrog and probably claim for itself and claim for almost 1/5 of humanity, the opportunity for growth, the opportunity for getting where we need to for the benefit of a very, very large number of people, and probably set an example for where the rest can go. In a number of ways, I think the point has also been made that India's growth story and India's own story is not going to be similar to possibly even China's, in terms of it needs to be more technology-led than just manufacturing-led. It needs to be at the intersection of these two elements to really take people forward. And as a democracy and as a country which believes in democratic values, I think it's very important also to take everybody along. So that becomes an important part of this framework as well. So that's the context of, I think, in a sense, what we intend to do with digital public infrastructure, which is an important part of democratizing access to public services, democratizing and making it cheaper, making it more productive, making it more efficient to develop many of these services, while at the same time protecting privacy issues, data security issues, and all the other issues that you heard Mrs. Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw speak of just now. The Prime Minister has recently also announced in the virtual summit of the G20 that we will set up a fund, an independent fund, to actually take forward this message of digital public infrastructure and help to operationalize it. And we will get many more countries, philanthropies, and others on board to actually ensure that the impact of this is delivered to scale. And more interestingly, the other part of what we do here is that it's not just a government effort, but it's something which we're doing with a range of private companies, volunteers, and a whole host of civil society as well. It's not something that is independently government's effort, but an effort of a large number of people who come together to see that this actually happens at scale. And that, again, would be quite apparent through many of the sessions that you have had here. Alongside the DPI piece, which is an important bit of what the ministry is trying to do, there's also this whole bit, at least in the Indian context, of actually being in the manufacturing space itself. Electronics today, electronics hardware, is probably going to be, or is already, the largest manufacturing sector, largest manufacturing industry in the world. And as a country, I think we need to be in that space. It is our policy that we need to be significantly in that space to actually deliver on this particular dream. The government launched the production-linked incentive schemes across 14 different sectors, but the most successful one ended up being in the electronic space and mobile phones, which we talk about with a great amount of pride, and the way in which today almost practically every phone that is used in India, every smartphone that is used in India is manufactured in India, and it is simply democratized access. You can't deliver with DPIs unless people have an instrument with which they can function, and that is what I think the PLI in the electronics sector and with the mobile phones has really done to this country. But at the same time, there are economists and others who do make the point that in the PLI program, what have you really achieved in terms of value addition? We need to recognize that these are parts of global value chains. No country in the world, not even China, has more than about 40 to 45% of that value chain embedded within the country. This morning's newspaper talks about Jensen Huang of NVIDIA saying that it will take the United States 20 years to completely have the semiconductor chip manufacturing within the United States. It started there, it was right there, then simply because it is a global value chain, it went across the world. I don't think in today's world, in the way that we are connected, we're going to make 100% of any of these high-value products right there. It doesn't make sense. The global value chains are a marriage of our overall security interests and basic economics of what it means to have division of labor and specialization and what trade theory is fundamentally based on. That being the case, I think you need to produce where it is most efficient to produce, where it is competitive to produce, but at the same time, what is called a resilient supply chain today is essential. We have to ensure that you have alternative supplies. You have to ensure that your dependence on single sources of supplies don't kneecap you when you really need to go forward. During the pandemic, and at that point I was doing a different job in a different place, we found that the automobile industry in India, including in the area around Chennai where I was serving at that time, had virtually come to a standstill simply because they didn't have enough chips to actually put into the cars. Everything else about the car was ready. This was probably the smallest piece of equipment that needed to go into the car, but it was just held up on account of that. I think that convinced a lot of people, both in India and elsewhere in the world, that you really need to talk about resilient supply chains and sustainable supply chains, and that's an issue which came to fore. Now, where does India fit into this entire story, and how does India then retain a substantial portion of this manufacturing pie? It is simply by making sure that we are competitive enough in the component manufacturing industry for this to happen. Today, when we speak of, almost the entire requirement of our mobile phones being manufactured in India, we also need to realize that in many of these places, the value addition is probably about 10 to 15%. We need to go closer to about 35 to 40% in order for this reality to happen. And that's where the rest of the government of India's thrust is. How do you bring in component manufacturing in the country? How do you ultimately bring in even semiconductor manufacturing into the country for this to happen? And we've had those breakthroughs. We've had the breakthrough of Micron establishing a manufacturing facility here in India. We have this breakthrough and a funny situation where practically the entire design of semiconductors for almost all the fabless chip companies in the world actually take place in India, actually takes place probably within a few square miles in Bangalore, but none of that IP actually gets owned here. Nobody runs one of these companies directly. So there are many parts of this electronic supply chain that as a country we really need to get in, and that is the other major tech priority for India and the area where we really need to move. And the Government of India's programs and schemes in this sector are fundamentally designed to achieve this. And interestingly enough, I think India, with its entire complex political system, multiple parties, multiple economies, particularly in the southern part of India today, but all of them work together. At least there is this identity of purpose, there is this commonality of purpose to see that we push forward on this particular segment of electronics manufacturing altogether. And that's an area where I think the developments have been significant, and we should also recognize and realize that today we are in a situation where the largest factories which actually operate in India are in this space. In India, it was unheard of to actually find 50,000 people employed on one premises. I came across cases where, we had a former chief economic advisor asking me, saying, are you confident that you will actually be able to ensure that in India we are able to build a factory which will employ 200,000 people? If you're not able to do it, you will not be competitive. I think our model tends to be a little different. We may not be able to go to 200,000 for various other social reasons, but we can go to 50,000, we can go to 40,000 and so on, which for a traditional industrialist in India is unthinkable. Somebody from, I do recall somebody who was a very big player in the automobile sector telling me, saying, 20,000, 30,000, are you crazy? I can't manage more than 1,000 workers in my factory. How are you guys actually telling me that factories are running with so many more? But I think that leap has been made, that change in direction has been made, and we are in a position to actually today ensure that this particular segment of manufacturing in India further deepens, and we would be able to deliver this thanks to coming together of industry, sense of purpose, with a lot of international collaboration as well, with a lot of cooperation, and I think at the government levels, at various levels, there's been the recognition of this need and the need to go forward in a very systematic and sustained fashion. Which then brings me to two other areas which I think we need to speak of very quickly. The first is what happens with emerging technologies and how emerging technologies then get applied into this entire segment. Everyone is talking about artificial intelligence. The application of artificial intelligence in, say, drug discovery was something which was the topic of the session just before this. Artificial intelligence is at the forefront. There are international events going on all the time. We had one in the UK in early November. We are going to have one in another less than 10 days' time, in a week's time here in Delhi. The Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence is being hosted in Delhi, and India is taking over as the chair of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. These are clearly areas which are coming into their own. Artificial intelligence is not new. We've heard about it for more than 30 years or longer, but it's now finally available almost as a consumer product for many people, and that's why it suddenly comes into the news. But I think we also recognize at the government level that the possibilities of actually deploying this at scale and ensuring that it has impact in science, it has impact in industry, it has impact across the board, and thereby enhancing productivity is probably significantly more important. And that innovation is something that needs to be encouraged, and it needs to happen on a far bigger scale through greater industry and academia linkages than to constantly worry about what will happen with deep fakes and how do we deal with it. There's a regulatory part of what we deal with, the consumer end of business, and how we regulate the deep fakes, and that's something that we will certainly work on and we will certainly deal with. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of sparking innovation in this space, and ensuring that it happens in a way that works for everybody. And that's where I come back to the possible benefits of another industrial revolution led by that space, so that we are in a position as a state and as a nation to progress onto that level. And the last thing, of course, is that along with artificial intelligence, a number of other technologies which will come up in due course, which across the world there's an effort to work on. But alongside all of those technologies is also the entire governance piece and the way in which data gets used. The fact that data is in silos, data is often unusable, is a reality. But I think the other thing which the entire DPI piece and the way that governance itself is delivered in India using technology means that huge volumes of administrative data and other forms of data are now available, at least in an electronic version and in real time, and with some amount of cleansing and with some amount of reorganization, and with, of course, most importantly, anonymization to ensure that privacy aspects are addressed, we can actually have large volumes of data through the India Datasets program and otherwise, which will be available for use by a whole set of researchers. I do not even want to speculate as to what can be done with this data and to what degrees it can be taken and how people can work with it to actually possibly do a lot of good, maybe some harm, but end up doing a real service to humanity and use it in exceptional ways to take forward advancement of science, to take forward advancement of drug discovery, to take forward enhanced ways of productivity and so on. So that's one set of issues that clearly need to be looked at in the data field. I'm sure you've had conversations already on the Digital Data Protection Act. The DPDP Act is something that you've already spoken of and you've already discussed in some depth. I don't want to go back into that area, but clearly I think in India's case, we are still in the process of drafting the rules, but in the approximately 3 months that I've been in this job, there's excellent feedback that I get on this. Clearly, whenever we bring out legislation or whenever we bring out anything new from a policy from government's side, when there's a whole bunch of people who are extremely critical and another whole bunch of people who are extremely happy with something, then we know that we've got the balance wrong. But when we have a whole bunch of people who are saying, I don't know, I think it looks all right and I think I can live with this, then probably we've got the balance right. Nobody is entirely happy, nobody is entirely unhappy. And I think that's the sweet spot which the DPDP Act has already hit, and I'm sure that is a venture which will go forward. And the last point that I'd like to touch on this morning or this afternoon would be on inclusion. And I think the need to sort of see that all of these technologies and the way that they are applied include a large number of people, include large segments of the population is very crucial, particularly in a country like India. And therefore, the emphasis on digital skilling, the emphasis on making sure that the digital divide doesn't widen and people are, in a sense, I mean, the digital divide is actually narrowed thanks to hardware, thanks to the fact that people have instruments in their hand. But the next step of making sure that how they use the technology and go forward, that people don't get left out of jobs, people don't get left out of economic opportunities, and equally, another big segment of the population, particularly in India, as the population ages, the elderly don't get cheated, don't get affected by cybercrime, which is becoming more sophisticated as we go along, becomes important. So there's a whole skilling agenda in this bit, there's a whole awareness agenda in this bit that we need to work on, and that is a constant effort that we need to do. And also in the regulatory space, there's a fair amount of action that needs to happen here. And that, again, is something crucial and important that the government will continue to focus on. So this is broadly at a very, very macro level. I just wanted to address some of the key concerns and areas that the Government of India is working on and the Ministry is working on. Thank you very much for this very patient hearing. It might have been easier if it was an interactive session. I could have addressed specific questions, but I just wanted to give it as broad brush a coverage as I could to see that I touched all the crucial things that we are looking at today. Thank you very much for the very patient hearing.